Growing up in Singapore and Malaysia, you are likely smartened up about the prevalence of the dangers of black magic from Thailand and surrounding countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. We use terms like Kong Tao, Jiang Tou, Xia Gu, or Xia Jiang, originated from the 14th century in southern China, especially the region formerly known as Nanyue, which stretched from Guangdong, Fujian, to northern Vietnam. The flagrant usage of Jing Can, or golden silkworm, by the people of the Miao tribe was well known to incur fear to their enemies and innocent victims alike. When the black magic and witchcraft transitioned to Thailand, there was a melding of the art with some of the local practices and faith, and it emerged into prominence when it turned into a commercial tool for the practitioner, usually known as Ajahn, who will be engaged to set a curse by their clientele who was willing to pay a handsome sum to attain their target in the most unscrupulous manner imaginable. In 2026, a movie co-produced by studios from Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand looked into this nefarious trait that left a trail of devastation and homicide. Kong Tao is co-directed by Malaysian directors Yong and Chiek, with a screenplay from Chen Huan-sen, featuring a multinational cast including actors and social media influencers from the countries of origin and Hong Kong. In a prologue which instantly highlighted the threat of the art of black magic, which could transcend distance and space when an Ajahn, likely from the province of Songkhla, sent a curse to a town in Malaysia which abhorrently decimated a classroom of young children and their teacher. When the school authorities unraveled the tragic scene, it became a sensational piece of news that shook both countries. It became apparent that the deaths was used as a warning for the village to sell the land to a despicable and horrendous land developer. Thai reporter Fawn made her life mission to uncover the truth to this crime, which of course did not bear any hard evidence to incriminate the culprit. Fawn began her investigative work by hoping a renowned abbot in this monastery could tell her more about the nature of the black magic, and was stunned when the monk was not going to reveal anything to her. She crossed paths with 4 Singapore-based YouTubers whose channel was on paranormal investigation, and they had travelled to Thailand hoping to do more comprehensive research on the black magic. The quartet was pretty innocuous with the exception of the lecherous Kang, who boasted using corpse oil to lure unsuspecting women for sex. However, they were targeted by an apprentice of a local black magic practitioner when a foot massager he knew looked at Kang in a very apprehensive and distasteful manner. Therefore, the plot of Kong Tao was a dichotomy between the travails of the YouTubers and the investigative journalistic work from Fawn, who had an aide in Malaysia. The paths of the protagonists will cross again at the climactic end when it became a real battle of good versus evil. While Thai horror had its run with many memorable ones to note, and Malaysian horror skewed more towards comedies unlike their Indonesian counterpart, I have more apprehension with horror movies from Singapore. Chinese language movies in both Singapore and Malaysia are weird, as they bank on memes and fads with social media influencers who made a bit of wave in both market and truly dated these movies. The filmmakers here also paid too much reverence to Taiwanese and Hong Kong celebrities, hoping to help push these movies into the bigger Chinese-speaking market. In that case, Kong Tao worked, as it registered a substantial box office earning in Taiwan. I wondered if the nature of the plot of this movie could infiltrate into the PRC market as well. Despite the apprehension, I can feel the research done by the screenwriter to tell skin-crawling stories of black magic curses and using of paraphilia like corpse oil rampant in the region to solicit for salacious intents. There were definitely research done with the rituals by the various mediums and practitioners. The raw egg used to capture the possession before being cracked to reveal something unnatural was something I have heard before. Those needles released by the unrepentant Ajahn, or to me felt like coffin nails, which maneuvered with precision with its homing system to put the treacherous curse across hundreds of miles away, felt like the infamous Tuju curse we grew up knowing from this side of the world. This was perhaps as far as the lyrical I'm going to wax for Kong Tao. The plot felt a tad too ambitious and barely held together with a string with plot points and characters' motives all over the places. In actuality, the movie was not too long, though I could feel there was conscious effort to leave out some plot points that would make it more well-rounded, though it might not mean that it will improve the story. The The first major issue I had with the plot was the moral compass of the Ajah's apprentice. From the beginning, we knew he was harvesting and selling corpse oil, as well as doing rituals behind the back of his master. Yet he gave off the impression that he was the righteous character for audience to root for. That Kang fellow deserved all he got for his heinous acts, but why was the rest of the YouTubers being targeted as well? At the juncture, the apprentice was evidently the villain. His master, the Ajahn himself, felt like he was conscientious about the misdeeds he has done for money. He was physically depleted after what he had done. It was revealed that a white magic spiritual master was culpable for that depletion, leading to the Ajahn to go all in with revenge in his mind. Speaking of the compassionate white magic witch doctor who intercepted the Tuju Tuju, therefore reducing the scale of the curse on the school, he was addressed as Bai Shifu from the onset, making me linking to Bai Long Wang, a celebrated Chinese master based in Thailand, before we realized that it was a Malay Bomo whose craft felt like a mix of Buddhism, Islam, and even a version of the Gu the Ajahn was practicing. It was awfully convoluted. We were served with a kaiju battle in the climatic end with MCU caliber CGI magical shield. The theatre I watched the movie in was howling in laughter for all this tomfoolery. Can you blame them? There was something bothering me with the YouTubers as well. Being a novice content creator myself, who needed to do recording of our explorations of both urban and natural landscapes, it was not feasible to keep filming while stumbling through our tropical jungle, especially with the immense undergrowth. You just need to keep a lookout at where you were stepping on. Otherwise, the falsification of the haunting in some locations was a very authentic representation of how low some paranormal content creators would stoop to get more views. Finally, we found the Thai reporter. If I was her editor, she would likely not last very long in the bureau for spending too much time and expenses on covering something that might not matter for the local people. Her aide in Malaysia has spent his entire existence to research on black magic, which meant he had accrued enough wealth to be in such retirement style of living. The production value was decent for a movie in this region. As audience, we knew how difficult it was to get funding to make a movie, especially in Singapore, where many movies were part government funded. The story of Kong Tao would not require that emphatic budget. They could even do without the CGI battle scene, which was not horribly created to be frank. I could not recognize anyone in the cast aside from Mark Lee, who was an omnipresent in Singapore cinema, and then there was the pudgy YouTuber who was an actual social media influencer. In Thailand, we have Supastra Thanachat, who gave her all with the English enunciation. She was gorgeous looking, but highly doubtful if the facial features were authentic. It was the seasoned Hong Kong character actor Philip Keong who was the most recognizable face, having featured in many TV serials and movies. In his role as the Ajahn apprentice, he exercised a lot of restraint when doing his rituals and was scheming to fool gullible young people to fall into his trap. Is Kong Tao one of the best horror features from Singapore and Malaysia? Considering the low bar of horror films here, it might not be far from that mark. Will it be an endearing movie for the ages? Don't bet your last penny on it. Kong Tao is a 6.5 out of 10 for me. Good effort, but still not good enough. That was a locally made horror film that I've been waiting to catch, and I was glad that it was streaming on Netflix. That would be Kelvin Tong's The Maid. Rosa is a domestic helper from a small village in Philippines, urgently needed to raise money for medical bills of her ailing younger brother. But arriving to the shores of Singapore during the start of the lunar 7th month, which symbolized the belief of the opening of the gates of hell with hungry ghosts coming to the human realm for offerings, it felt like a red flag which Rosa was oblivious to, of course. Rosa's employers were a middle-aged Chinese couple by the surname of Teo. They owned a Chinese opera troupe singing in the dialect of Teochew, which they communicated daily as well. This was a pleasant surprise for me, being the same dialect group. When our government loosened the grip of the usage of dialects in local movies, we will usually hear characters communicating in Hokkien, which was slightly more uncouth but colourful. The Teos were mild-mannered and welcomed Rosa amicably, except they did not tell her they had a grown-up son Asun, who had the mental capacity of a young child. For Rosa, the domestic house chores were not taxing for her physically, it was taxing for her to be away from her family. Although she was kind towards Rosa, Mrs. Teo was keeping a leash on Rosa, restricting her interaction with people outside, even the postman. The nefarious intents behind Rosa's employment started to rear its horns when our poor protagonist started seeing apparitions around the creaking shophouse, which in today's economy would worth a pretty penny. Kelvin Tong's The Maid succinctly introduced the concept of the Hungry Ghost Month to other non-practicing regions in Asia and other corners of the world, as well as the practice of necrogamy or posthumous marriage in Chinese culture. The movie also touched upon taboos like refraining to sit in the front row of seats during a public performance in the Hungry Ghost Month, as those were reserved for the ghosts who were drawn to the performances meant for them as much as for the living. The idea of a posthumous marriage drew a bit of controversy during the time when it was released. As we looked more into the works of director Kelvin Tong in a second, he definitely gathered the skin-crawling essence from the halcyon days of Asian horror, with the dreary mood of the house where Rosa was spending her days in, to be petrified with her serial encounters with the entity haunting in the storied house. Tong was not subtle with his utility of sound effects and score to stir the scares to a point that it got increasingly distracting and ruined the atmosphere he was so painstakingly creating. It was apparent he had picked out the right tools to tell an effective horror story, but he also picked up the wrong indulgence. Coming at the heels of the financially successful behemoth The Eye, Kelvin Tong also made Rosa bearing the ability to see dead people, and in this particular month, they were everywhere. In Filipino actress Alessandra De Rossi, they also found their Filipino version of Angelica Lee from The Eye. While seasoned local character actors Chen Shu-chen and Hong Hui-fang gave their all with balancing benevolence and malevolence in their performances, the plot did not offer audiences more insights with their motivations and cranked up the scares, especially how it failed to captivate the audience due to the indulgence of the director. I think the actor who played Soon was named Benny So, who could predominantly be a stage actor as we could not see him in any other prominent roles on screen. But as Robert Downey Jr. said in Tropic Thunder, never go into full retard. As much as So was convincing in his performance, his appearance on the screen was getting tiresome, especially when his role was so integral into the story. One urban legend I could recall, although I could not find any article or mention of it online, was that during the theatrical run in 2005, a local cineplex had put up a life-size poster with the scary ghost bride on the poster in a female toilet within the facility. It freaked out many patrons who had to answer nature's call during their movie watching. I do hope no unsuspecting victim was traumatized too much from it. The Maid was a financial and critical success for Tong and Raintree Pictures, and I was glad they did not hit the iron when it was hot with a sequel, because I doubt I could tolerate with more unadulterated indulgence. The Maid is a 6 out of 10 for me. Kudos to Netflix to offer this for our streaming pleasure. With this double bill of Singapore horror offerings, it gave me the golden opportunity to look through the history of horror from my country, which is less storied as compared to our neighbours, but it did mean something to our people here no less. Local cinema began life pre-World War II in the 1930s with Malay films. After the war, Film Studio Cathay, who owned a chain of cinemas in both Singapore, was part of Malaysia back then, and Malaysia itself, collaborated with Curry's film production to form the Cathay Curry Studio and started making popular Malay films to cater to the local cinema goers. The company wanted to compete with their main rivals, Shaw Brothers, who had started making black and white Malay films prior to the war. The first monumental financial hit from Cathay Curry's was Pontianak in April 1957. Produced by a Chinese man, written by a Malay man, and directed by B.N. Rao, a native Indian man, Pontianak was a twist on the Malay folklore with a vengeful vampire spirit of a woman who died during childbirth, returning to bait on other expecting mothers. The movie was dubbed in Mandarin, which was why it opened to fanfare from a wider population in Singapore and Malaysia. The success of Pontianak encouraged Cathay Curry's to make multiple sequels, including Dendam Pontianak or Revenge of the Pontianak in 1957 and Sumpah Pontianak, Curse of the Pontianak in 1958. These movies were shown at a time when Malaysia was gaining independence from the British, allowing people to channel their insecurities and jitters about their future through a storytelling medium with a more imminent fear, albeit a supernatural one. The fanfare and cultural zeitgeist these movies created triggered Shaw Brothers to make Pontianak movies of their own, including Anak Pontianak or Son of Pontianak in 1958 by Filipino director Raymond Estela. While Malay kampongs or villages in the region were cowering in fear of a flying vampire of the female persuasion, other directors like L. Krishnan gave us scary tales of Orang Minyak and Mat Santo's Mat Toyo, combined comedy and horror with stories of the mischievous ghost child. The deluge of locally made Malayan folk horror ended in around 1959 to 1960 as the popularity of these films made by both studios was waning going into 1960s and Singapore-made movies went into dormancy. In 1981, the island nation was shook by the heinous crimes committed by a spiritual medium by the name of Adrian Lim and his harem of mistresses. The influence of incorrigible fake snake oil salesmen, masquerading as spiritual masters and gurus while swindling their clientele, was still sexually assaulting unsuspecting victims, or in this case, doing human sacrifices with young children for their occultist rituals, were truly horror movies in real life. It was by no surprise that Adrian Lim crimes were translated to the big screen with Medium Rare or The Medium from British director Arthur Smith in the year 1991. I remember 1991 was a monumental year with regards to the Singapore government easing the restriction with local art scene including music and movies. Although Medium Rare was not a movie worth a note and was liked on the scarce or the grotesque, in actual fact ponderous and talky, it actually see young independent filmmakers starting to make movies of Singapore context. Hong Kong TV actor Hugo Ng, who started his acting career in Singapore, would work on the same subject of Adrian Lim with God or Dog, with Ng directing the film and portraying Lim himself. I did remember the movie created a bit of ruckus when it was released, with Ng creating it in the Hong Kong Category 3 movie style, which generally did not propel him forward with his directing career. While 1998's The Mirror, a horror anthology about an antique mirror with supernatural powers bringing tragedy to the string of owners, was made by Hong Kong director Raymond Wong and produced by his company, there was a segment shot in Singapore featuring the likes of Jack Neo and Lin Po. Neo played a greedy lawyer who fought for an unredeemable murderer, only for the mirror turning his life into a living hell. The Eye from the Pang Brothers is a seminal Asian horror film during the period when horror movies from Japan, South Korea and Thailand had made global audiences sit up and take notice. The movie about a Hong Kong lady who was blind at birth, getting optical transplant from an unknown donor from Thailand, only realizing she could see ghosts roaming the living world, was actually funded by Raintree Pictures, a subsidiary of local media company Mediacorp. There was nothing Singaporean about the movie, with the exception of the involvement of local actors Edmund Chen and Pie Peng as a couple of doctors. The success of The Eye saw the Pang Brothers making the standalone sequel with The Eye 2, which was substantially shot in Singapore and littered with local actors in many small, unnamed roles. As we have reviewed The Maid from Kelvin Tong, let's look into some horror movies the movie critic turned director had made. Some of his movies came with acclaims overseas. Man in White from 2007 was a stark contrast to The Maid, a humor-infused social commentary of Singapore government and irksome issues in the country through the eyes of a group of newly deceased individuals. A year later, he made Rule No. 1, a police drama which dealt with a lot of supernatural interruptions, something the Hong Kong police force refused to acknowledge. While this was predominantly shot in Hong Kong, with Ekin Cheng and Sean Yue in the leading roles, but with Tong and co-star Fiona Xie, there was enough Singapore representation. In 2016, Kelvin Tong made a demonic possession movie in the style of modern exorcism movie called The Faith of Anna Waters. An American journalist came to seek the truth behind the sudden departure of a sister who was based in Singapore. So this fish-out-of-water adventure with the supernatural threat failed to cause much of a ripple in the cinematic scene with awful reception. Tong had a better time in 2023 making a horror flick to cater to local tastes with Confinement, which delved into a postnatal fear to new mother when the confinement lady or helper had devious intention with the employer and the baby. After the heydays of Cathay Carey's and Shaw Brothers' black and white Malay films, the Malay folklores with Pontianak, Pocong, Toyo, and the likes were always a hot topic for filmmakers to tackle upon, because it brought out the innate fear from those who had listened to their stories from their grandparents growing up. Return to Pontianak was an independent film shot by director Jin and his team about a Japanese lady going to find her family roots in the deep dark jungles within the place aptly named as Pontianak. Made 2 years after the release of the Blair Witch Project, the influence of that seminal found footage horror was evident, yet from the scathing reviews, it felt like more of a mockery of the genre. Perhaps having Pontianak chasing these obnoxious young people in such horrible dark potato film quality might be something for those with a selective taste in their horror films. In 2019, seasoned theatre director Glenn Gui directed Revenge of Pontianak, or Dam Dam Pontianak, which I'm not sure is a direct remake of the 1957 Cathay Carey's film of the same name. This movie demonstrated how a man could be much scarier than the supernatural entity haunting him. Mike Wee Luan's Orang Ikan from 2024 is a strange creature feature with a bit of folklore, more akin to cryptids like Creature from Black Lagoon or Kappa from Japan. Set during World War II, a pair of prisoners struggling to survive were facing a danger that was much more unpredictable than their pursuers. The title of the movie on Netflix is called Monster Island, which baffled viewers thinking it might be another of those legendary studios' King Kong Godzilla movies. With Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand hogging the limelight with folk horror in terms of quality in storytelling and production value, Singapore will always take a backseat in this subgenre for the foreseeable future. Jack Neo, a local comedian who could be considered a celebrity before he started making movies in 1990s, was a quick-witted and multifaceted artist and was always able to be on the pulse of what the people in Singapore is interested in until he sustained waning relevancy, although his movies could still make money for whatever reason. Over the years, Neo had pushed many of his disciples into limelight, none more so than Mark Lee, who had that notable cameo in Kong Tao and had a hefty participation in movies of the Chinese language across the past 2 decades. Neo and Lee will collaborate with Where God Goes in 2009, an anthology comedy horror which covered 3 segments dealing in resorting to ask ghosts to gain unconventional wealth, breaking taboos in the nature, and a theme of filial piety from an earlier film from Jack Neo. The movie was a funnier affair than being horrifying. Mark Lee and co-director Boris Boo, another Neo's prodigy, would follow up with a sequel called The Ghost Must Be Crazy. The movie was notable for Lee to cross-dress as a truly horrifying-looking Peranakan woman. Ultimately, Singapore heartlanders would go to movie for a quick laugh, even if it was one of the paranormal context. Therefore, we will see a slate of horror comedies over the years, including Boris Boo, Greedy Ghosts, Mark Lee's Running Ghosts, Meng Ong's A Fantastic Ghost Wedding, and Han Yu Kwan's When Ghosts Meet Zombie, which even included a fascination with jiangshi from the heydays of the Hong Kong 1980s movies. From Where God Goes and the sequel The Ghost Must Be Crazy, the much charted and popular setting for ghost stories in Singapore is with the military. Singapore men after 18 years old have to be conscripted to serve a mandatory 2 years of national service. Beside the physical and mental torture, army camps and exercise grounds were well-known haunts for the haunting, leading to so many army ghost stories which were well celebrated and never grew old to stir the interest of audiences. S.N. Sivalingam's Pulau Hantu from 2008 was perhaps the first movie that dabbled into the supernatural in a military setting. A group of soldiers deployed to find a soldier who went AWOL and stumbled on an island known as Pulau Hantu or Ghost Island, which naturally meant things were not going to end well for these soldiers. A trivia is that Pulau Hantu is a real location within the vicinity of Singapore. From director Gilbert Chan, we have 2359 from 2001, the title which highlighted the much dreaded timing soldiers needed to report to the camp, which featured well-known urban legends of local army ghost stories, which can make those who had heard of these stories and live in these places to shudder when the scenes unwind on screen. That said, the execution leave a lot to be desired. A sequel titled Haunting Hour from Chan went into the anthology mode with a chap in his basic military training running a ghost stories blog which provided original ghost stories of different era in the military. I watched it recently and found it a bit more entertaining than the original film. Perhaps I was in a good mood. Zombie Pura from director Jason Tan from 2018 was perhaps Singapore's only zombie feature ever, and setting it in an army camp, it felt like a concerted effort not to pile up the budget if the location was confined. Let's go through the rest of the horror offerings from Singapore, which touch on the sights and sounds we can find in the country, as well as superstitions and taboos shrouding the land. Old Changi Hospital is widely known as one of the most haunted locations in Singapore. The hospital, which was a site of insurmountable horror through its history since 1937, ceased operation in 1997 but was never torn down and now became a place of intrigue for thrill seekers. In 2020, we have a local mockumentary titled Haunted Changi from Andrew Lau, which might not measure up to Konjam Asylum for sure. Circle Line is one of the railway service under Singapore Mass Rapid Transit, which started operation in 2011. The automated driverless carriage system, which covered the central to southern region of the island, is operated fully below strata and had its fair share of massive train breakdowns. However, from director J.D. Chua, it spun a whimsical creature feature using the dark abyss that the Circle Line encompassed as a backdrop where something evil was lurking. While the concept was interesting, the final product of this 2013 film titled Circle Line was being laughed at for the amateurish production. Several aspiring directors used the pain of losing loved ones or the struggles to survive or saturate the financial and emotional needs of their family in some supernatural storytelling. In Gilbert Chan's Ghost Child from 2013, a widower tried to resurrect his family nucleus with a new wife and his teenage daughter, only to realize his plan was going to be foiled by the titular Ghost Child, or more commonly known as Toyo in local colloquial. In Lee Tianjin's Bring Back the Dead from 2015, we have the classic story of a distraught mother who could not get over the death of her young child and decided to dabble in the forbidden to bring the deceased back to life. In Chai Yi-wei's Blood Ties from 2009, a grievous murder to a police detective left a strong desire for revenge from the spirit, which he needed to use his loved one as a conduit to execute his plan. The movie featured the recently departed Cheng Pei Pei, who was most famous from Ang's Lee, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Chai Yi-wei, who built a name in local cinematic scene in both the big and small screens, who followed up with Twisted in 2011, which was a horror anthology of 3 stories to decipher whether the bad luck suffered by a protagonist was sheer coincidence or something more sinister. Horror anthologies were an easy medium for directors and screenwriters who wanted to gain entry into local filmmaking scene. We have already talked about Where God Goes from Jack Neo and its sequel. Hellhole from Sam Low in 2019 was an ambitious Singapore-Hong Kong production that was badly affected by the COVID pandemic. I caught this movie on a premiere. Let's just say I would be lying through my teeth if I told the director who was present in the screening that was a good movie. Ko Chong-woo, Last Night Ride, strung a few well-known local urban legends and taboos in 3 interconnected stories. It was definitely better than Hellhole. Then we have Thai director Subakong Rangsuwan's The Antique Shop from 2022, which was a Thai-Singapore production featuring 3 scary tales of picking suspicious items from an antique shop. This was notable in Singapore as a movie released posthumously for actor Aloysius Pang, who died tragically from a military training. Radio DJ Dennis Chew was building a persona of telling scary ghost stories in his long-running radio segment. It was natural for him to be featured in Ghosts on Air, a movie released in 2012 from director Cheng Ting An. Chew played a fictitious version of himself who was haunted by the ghost stories he told on air, which tell us that in Chinese belief, when you make content about the supernatural, you will garner not just merely living audiences. The Chosen One by Lim Swat Yuan is a more recent entry into Singapore horror from 2024. The Chinese title, translated as The Hooligan Exorcist, was succinct to what the plot was going to be like, with the typical local comedy from the heartlands with some action and horror elements. I would like to give a shout out to a local independent production known as The Damned Ones from 2025 by writer-director Rina Dean. Dean suffers from dyslexia and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, was a former teacher who had to turn to filmmaking when her job was badly disrupted by the pandemic. The Damned One was a horror themed mystery which had disabled protagonists played by disabled actors, but the story itself does not revolve around the disabilities. The film was a medium to make marginalized people of the society feel the way that they should be viewed on equal ground as normal people without subverting the talk about the obvious. Last but not least, in 2023, there were a pair of dramatic features from Singaporean directors that used supernatural elements in their story, yet they were far from being categorized as horror movies. Firstly, 7 Days from Grace Wu made use of the concept of a deceased who realized they were dead on the 7th day of their passing and returned to see their loved ones. Secondly, we have Last Shadow at the First Light by Nicole Midori Woodford, in which Ami, a Singaporean girl with a Japanese mother who went missing, was haunted by recurring apparitions and made a journey back to her mother's hometown to uncover the mystery. In conclusion, horror genre in Singapore cinema was an acquired taste due to the limit in budget and sometimes restriction in artistic liberty as well as the censorship board. As of all Singaporean films, horror movies banked on the latest fad and talking points, making the films dated to the time period. In some strange ways, it can be nostalgic for people who lived through those times in these ever-revolving landscapes. As a Singapore-based movie review channel, finding a decent one to review without bailing from the movie was an uphill task. I'm looking forward to more works from our local filmmakers. If you have enjoyed this comprehensive look through the history of Singapore horror movies, as well as the double-build reviews of Kong Tao and The Maid, please drop me a like and share the video for anyone who had no idea that Singapore actually made movies, no less of the horror genre. I also done a comprehensive look into horror master Sam Raimi's works in the horror genre, tagging onto the review of his latest offering, Send Help. From the list of Singapore horror movies, there was a glaring absence of horror films from the Indian or Hindu population, but I'm hoping to be corrected on that.